The Crusades are a bloody and horrific 200-year stain on European history. They were a time where religious intensity led to the death of over 1 million people. It wasn't just the fighting that could kill you, though. The whole time period was filled with ways that you could die. Welcome to Crazy Histories, where we bring you the craziest, weirdest facts from human history. Some of the things discussed in this video may not be suitable for everyone. Viewer discretion is advised. What were the Crusades? Between the years 1096 and 1291, there were 8 major crusade expeditions that happened. There were many smaller occurrences that happened in this time and after as well, though none were to the extent that these first 8 were. So what exactly were the Crusades? Well, they were a series of religious wars between Christians and Muslims in order to gain control of parts of the Middle East where both religions had holy sites. It wasn't just a battle for the land, though. Many people that went on the Crusades were not knights or fighters, but ordinary people who were taking the opportunity to go on a pilgrimage to these same holy sites. It was normal for the number of people on the pilgrimage to grow as the group journeyed on, picking up people from each town they passed by who were eager to help reclaim the Holy Lands. Every single person that joined in the crusade was expected to sew a cross onto all of their clothes, even the people who did not intend to fight. This started as a modest thing, as a simple cross outline, but grew over time to be much more elaborate. Even by the time the Second Crusade rolled around, the crosses had grown in their meaning. Different cross colors represented the person's home country who went crusading. The crusade path was also not limited to just men, as you might think. Although there were attempts made to forbid women from tagging along, they made up a large part of the pilgrimage. The First Crusade, especially, saw many women. It was much more of a spontaneous event than the later Crusades and a more migratory time. Christian sources say that the women followed to do the washing and other common womanly tasks. However, the Muslim sources note that women did fight and lead in battles. It wasn't common for women to be a part of the fighting force, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. The famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, then the wife of French King Louis VII, is said to have taken up arms in the Second Crusade and have actually led a force in the place of her husband. Historians disagree on whether or not this happened, but do all agree that she was a fierce political and diplomatic leader, and that she did much to aid the French on this mission. There is another rumor that says Eleanor led a force of 300 women into battle, though this has been debunked a number of times. The fact that people believed it for so long, though, just proves that it was not unheard of for women to be in the fighting force. Traveling to the Holy Lands. The journey from the Europeans' homes to the Holy Land was a long and dangerous one. Some made the trip completely by land, traveling through modern Germany, Hungary, the Balkans, and into Turkey. Others, though, chose to take a water route. They would travel by sea from Italy and through the Mediterranean to the Holy Lands. Others still would do a combined land and sea route, walking south through Italy, crossing the Adriatic Sea by boat, and then continuing on foot through the Balkans. However they chose to travel, the journey was not an easy one. Those that took land routes were sure to experience hunger, fatigue, and exhaustion. The supply chain of the time wasn't exactly what you might call reliable. This meant that food and supply rations were slim, and this led to many people going to great lengths to avoid starvation. They would barter and beg in the towns along the way, and forage along the path when they weren't near other people. There is even some reason to believe that some people turned to cannibalism in 1098 at the Battle of Antioch. The hardships of travel were not just for the peasants that took up the cross. Knights too experienced thin rations, and some were so desperate that they even ate their horses. This would have been a knight's last resort, though, as being a horseless knight was a very shameful thing. A horse was vital to a knight being able to perform his duties properly, as they helped a knight move easily through a battlefield. The group that would have been the least worried about starving were the nobility. They had the means to be able to buy food and supplies at the towns they passed through on the way to the Holy Lands. This doesn't mean that they did not have to be wary of how quickly they went through their supplies, or that they provided for any of the people traveling with them. It wasn't just the people on the crusade that suffered because of the crusade. Oftentimes, the violence in the name of God started long before the Christians reached the Holy Lands. Although the Pope ever called for this, pagans and Jewish people were often the victims of this type of violence. There was a particularly infamous set of massacres that happened in 1096, the very first year of the Crusades. They were led by Count Amicio of the Rhineland, and even today, These killings are recognized as an important turning point in relations between Christians and Jews, and are a noted event in the history of anti-Semitism. The attack started in Speyer in modern-day Germany and grew in fervor as the Crusaders traveled through Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. Many of the local Jewish people looked for protection, and sometimes received it from the local bishop. They also sought help from their neighbors and took sanctuary in temples. The Jewish people that were not able to get help were forced to convert to Christianity or die, and many chose death. There are accounts that show some Jews chose to kill their children and themselves rather than face the brutality of the Crusaders. Illness in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just starvation and violence that was a threat to people along the Crusade path, but illness and infection was also a great concern. The most common and least of people's worries was lice. Pretty much everyone during this time had a permalice. As if the constant head itching wasn't enough, any number of skin disorders and diseases would make for more itching, leprosy being the most common. Although some of what they called leprosy at the time was probably any number of other things, it was still a big issue because of the high risk of spreading it to others. Also common illnesses both in daily life and along the path to the Middle East were dysentery, which they called the flux, tuberculosis, smallpox, scabies, a rash caused by a mite, erysipelas, a painful rash, trachoma, an eye disease that can lead to blindness, and the sweating sickness, which doctors today think was probably influenza. One of the most dangerous and most common causes of death among women was childbirth. On top of the general complications that can happen, the lack of clean supplies in delivery areas would have made women more susceptible to infection. Reaching the Holy Lands. Once the mass of people did reach the Holy Lands, they generally weren't in their top fighting shape. Many people were exhausted, starving, and sick. Diseases ran rampant through camp. The lack of supplies and poor morale led to infighting and mistrust among the Crusaders, who already had little trust in one another. Europe at this time was made up of small, feudal states, who very rarely got along with each other. These disagreements did not stop simply because two groups had a common goal. There were often disagreements amongst different groups, which would sometimes lead to bigger infighting problems. These disagreements usually stayed small, but could get bigger if not squashed by superiors. While there may have been infighting with those on crusade, there was tentative peace back home in Europe. At the time, there were many rivalries amongst the nobility, and if a leader took his army away to fight somewhere else, he had to worry that his land would be taken by a neighboring ruler. This led to many temporary treaties to be made that would allow for both rulers to comfortably leave their lands without fear that they would be taken by the other while they were gone. The Crusader States. One of the products of the First Crusade was the creation of the 4 Crusader States. Those were territories in the Middle East that were taken by the Europeans to be a permanent Christian settlement in the Holy Lands. They were the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the county of Tripoli. Some Crusaders and pilgrims went on the journey with the intention to stay in one of these lands because they saw a chance to build their power and fortunes in this new place. Even when there wasn't an official crusade going on, there was fighting happening in the Holy Land. The Muslim forces wanted to take back control of the Crusader States. In order to keep the Crusader States from falling, the Christians needed supplies and people. Two things they didn't regularly get outside of the larger-scale conflicts. This constant fighting and death must have worn down the spirits of both sides in the wars. The Crusades lasted for hundreds of years and set up relations between Europe and the Middle East for generations to come. It was a dangerous time to live. Death was all around in the form of war, disease, and infections. None of those seemed like a great way to go, but if I had to choose, I think I'd take a quick death on the battlefield over a slow and painful battle with leprosy. What do you think? Be sure to like this video if you found it useful. And don't forget to subscribe and sign up for notifications so you don't miss future videos.